People describe a lot these days that you can't rely on an algorithm to find your next favorite. But long gone are the days of easy access to a schmo behind the desk of a video store who has seen way too many titles of the stacks before you, ready to recommend you A based on your affection for B. I think no small part of the YouTube and podcast culture is a return to that dynamic, and I want to add to that pile in a new series I'm giving a whirl called Your Next Rental. As opposed to the kinda larger scale video essays I've trafficked in for a long time, Your Next Rental will zero in on one recommendation, probably a movie or game, and really dissect why I think you should give it a look. Just a chance to dust off some old titles I think are under-discussed. I can't promise these will be massive, obscure gems you've never ever heard of, but in our letterbox circles where everyone is watching the same 100 or so 4.0 conversation starters, well, who's to say some auteur director's third or so best movie still isn't really good? Germaine to that, do you recognize this famous scene?
Turn it off. Turn it off!
You've probably seen it memed, someone posting like, me reacting to the new Velma trailer, how cringe.
Turn it off!
But I always felt the virality of this scene was in sort of poor taste if you knew the context, that the funny man yelling is because he's being forced to watch an adult film starring his daughter. Hardcore is a 1979 film directed by Paul Schrader, a collaborator known for lending his voice to some of the most acclaimed scripts ever, and directing masterpieces like Mishima and First Reformed. Of course, if his sort of respectable cantankerousness on social media is any indicator, if you told him your favorite work of his was Hardcore, he'd probably have some four-letter words for you because by all accounts, he hates how this movie turned out, despite its devoted cult following thanks in no small part to the film's masterful lead actor George C. Scott, who also didn't apparently have a high opinion of this movie. He and Schrader fought on set a ton, and he spent the whole recording in a state of uncomfortable tumult. But I think it works given the premise of this film that you can feel how disgruntled he is, as we see Scott play Jake Van Dorne, the gruff dad you know like the back of your hand if you were raised in a Midwest Catholic household.
You're a very negative person. I mean, you gotta believe in something.
God has chosen a certain number of people to be saved, the elect, and he's chosen them from the beginning of time.
I don't intend these videos to be chronological play-by-plays, but I just gotta emphasize the opening credits of this movie because they are so damn pretty. Appropriate to the season in which I publish this video, you get this sweep over Christmas Day in sort of dreary if peaceful Michigan. The ornaments make these splashes of color as a blanket of snow seems to signal that all is calm, preserved, and dormant like a state of hibernation. It's not the blinding glitz of Christmas in, say, New York, but it's garland enduring heavy snowfall. It's bundled up Midwesterners scraping the snow off their windshields. It's so soothing, and if you're like me, it's that sense of security that's rattled by the heat wave we're hit with as the story transitions to blistering California, which is where Jake takes his pilgrimage in search of his daughter, who's gone missing and he's learned has been ingratiated into the seedy underbelly of the porn industry. Jake will stop at nothing to find his daughter, and it's the determination George C. Scott puts into the character that really helps the material sing. It's a fish-out-of-water story to maybe the most extreme. A father of devout Calvinist faith, with traditional values, forced to explore every nook and cranny of that which is downright unmentionable to him. You'd think maybe following a stuffy conservative guy through a journey like this might get exhausting, but his motivator being his sincere love and concern for his daughter puts him in a vulnerable spot. The circumstances are sketchy enough overall that there's reason to believe his poor daughter isn't being unionized per se in her line of work, and you side with him pretty handily. Clawing his way through dirty video theaters, toy stores, and executive offices, he has no choice but to chat up the antithesis of his pious values at every turn. a sort of boilerplate of stress that it's really hard to take your eyes off of. In conjunction with his apparently constant fights with Paul Schrader, George C. Scott was apparently not a far cry from his own character, in that the content of this film did ruffle his feathers. Sources say Scott was an atheist, to be clear, but he apparently hated the idea of filming in actual porno parlors, and although I don't know if the toll taken on his stress management was worth it, it really does help the character of Van Dorn come off as shook up and so close to bursting.
Here, take your 50 cents back.
That's all right.
No, take it. I don't want your goddamn 50 cents.
Lately, a few folks have pointed out the physical similarities between George C. Scott and Tim Robinson, of all people. And as odd a comparison as that is, I do think the way Scott plays frustration is kind of like Robinson, even if the latter is more frequently comedic. The heavy internalizing, the scrunching up just to contain one's own convictions. I could see an older Tim Robinson genuinely taking on a career similar to George C. Scott, who gives a lot of performances I think folks would levy as better than this movie, but I would never bet one as natural as the frantic but reserved Van Dorn. I think you can sum it up pretty nicely with the poster art you see most often for this movie, wherein most of the real estate is taken by pure black void, harboring the words, "Oh my God, that's my daughter," while George C. Scott is sequestered off to the corner of the image, and it helps you feel just how helpless he is in the conflict at hand. His daughter is missing and could be anywhere adult film is made, a universe Van Dorn, the character, knows nothing about. But geographically and idealistically, Jake Van Dorn is a stranger, which is a lot more interesting than him needing merely to investigate. Both the sheer scope of his mission in a literal sense and the daunting nature of investigating sex shops and brothels to him personally combine to make an incredibly engaging piece. His chemistry especially shines opposite Nikki, a sex worker who finds herself endeared to Jake's mission and decides to use her connections and street smarts to help him. You'd think at this point the film would go totally lopsided, favoring Nikki's free spirit or Jake's traditionalism, but the reality is more blended. The big city would chew Van Dorn up and spit him out without Nikki, who you can tell covets the structure Jake returns to in his suburban lifestyle, even if it's a bit foreign to her. Nikki is openly skeptical of the principles of Jake's faith, but what she never doubts is the peace and reliability it bestows Jake. She's not about to be converted, but there's a lot of thought put into whether the grass is greener on the other side. Jake has to confront his distance from his own daughter and how much of this is begotten by her own autonomy. And Nikki has to face that even if she can help Jake, they'll remain in separate worlds after the problem is solved. It's very much a movie about people who are thrust into worlds that counter their worldviews. And as retentive as Jake comes off, there's something to admire in how steadfast he remains. After encountering BDSM sellers and snuff screenings, he still upholds his values. You never get the idea it's healthy to be as dogmatic or staunch as he is, but there's a piece to respect in his convictions here. As heavy as all this sounds, the movie isn't without its funny moments too. Among Jake's tactics to find his daughter include a whole fake mustache getup he passes off as a disguise with which he holds a casting call for a porno, hoping someone might show up that can lead him to his daughter, and the results are nearly uncharacteristically funny.
I'm Dick Black. You're doing a porno movie, right?
I'm glad to meet you, Mr. Black, but I'm afraid you're not exactly the type we're looking for.
You mean because I'm black?
Given its sort of ambivalent stances on matters such as sexuality, adult commerce, and religion, a lot of audiences weren't sure what to do with hardcore back in the 70s. Many tenured critics liked it and gave it strong reviews, but it was also a topic of controversy, drawing ire from the Catholic Church and, on a less authoritative note, garnering nominations at something called the Stinkers Bad Movie Awards, which I know a little about, but believe much is said about the fact that it was outlived by the Razzies. Many critics had a prime sticking point with the movie's ending, ending, and I have to admit, this is by and large its weak point. I won't spoil it or give away anything specific, but the ending you see in the final product was not Schrader's intended conclusion, and he strongly feels the ending we got, which executives insisted on, ruins the movie. I truly think execution matters more than concept alone, so we'll never know how much better or worse hardcore would be if it ended the way Schrader intended. We know what his idea was, and to be frank, it doesn't compel me very much either. Again, I'm being vague, so not to spoil a movie itself, but like I said, I have a feeling Schrader's disappointment has more to do with what he hoped to display, as opposed to the idea on paper. But I felt it was the journey, not the destination, that made hardcore a worthwhile watch. The onset quarrels and coal raking from faith and critic-driven sources alike could have been the makings for a total shit show. But history, I think, looks pretty fondly at hardcore, and will continue to do so. Schrader has lent his voice to a handful of films many consider to be artistic triumphs, so I think this one gets swept under the rug in the wash, when you're competing for attention with Taxi Driver and Raging Bull. But I think hardcore is well worth a look. An intense and atmospheric diamond in the rough, I would stag as an undersung classic.
What do you mean, not the type? Man, don't you know who I am? I'm Big Dick Black. I've done more porno movies than you ever saw.